Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 29. And if we don't find this mythical Salem? Although the men stood nervously with their hats in their hands and their documents on the desk in front of General Thorne, they were most grateful to be there, and they told him that repeatedly. "Thank you so much for listening, General." They dithered and bobbed and shuffled. "Thank you for paying attention." "Yes, yes," he said shortly, to stop the head scientist, who showed signs of going into another 5-minute thank you speech. "You're sure about this now? Even all the way down in trades and over to waves? They received only a few inches of ash." The group of scientists nodded vigorously. "We just assumed that the ash would be good for the soil," one of them piped up. "In some areas they were able to lift the layers of hardened ash off the frozen ground, but everywhere else, so many followed the orders to till it into the farmland, and now it's like rock." He shifted, hoping someone would back him up. It was, after all, Thorne's order to till in the ash. "Perhaps, General, in hindsight, we should have moved the ash off the farmlands," another quaking man offered. "Some of our experiments suggested that in a few years the ash will become a wonderful addition to the soil, just not this year." The general shifted his hard gaze to the scientist who first gave him the bad news. The man looked askance at his colleagues, who provided no assistance beyond standing behind him, likely so he couldn't dart out of the door. Maybe if there'd been an older scientist, one with more experience and insight and better ideas, but all of them had died. "Tell me, gentlemen," the general said, "honestly now, will we be able to plant crops in this new year?" The men signaled each other with jerking motions, trying to get each other to give the answer. They thought they'd already alluded to this, but someone had to say the actual words. One of them sighed and announced, "No, sir, there's no hope of crops this year. Not unless we have some kind of miracle. Does Guide Lannard have any ideas?" "Not more sacrifices," someone in the back whispered. Thorne glared in the direction. "We need to discuss the situation, but gentlemen, there may be a miracle coming. There may also be a sacrifice, but it won't be additional deaths. It will instead appeal to the most adventurous men in the world." The scientists looked at each other in surprise. "Sir, could you be more specific?" one dared to ask. "No," he said crisply. "Thank you for your information. I recommend you keep your findings among yourselves until I am prepared to announce our next step. Is that understood?" Every man nodded enthusiastically. Thorne waved for them to leave, which they did also enthusiastically. Colonel Waynes, sitting quietly in the corner, waited until the door shut. "So, General, you have their report?" Thorne frowned at it. "They were rather prompt in producing it, weren't they?" "I think they've been waiting for you to ask. The snow should have left weeks ago, so I think the panic began back then." He leaned forward. "So, General, that next step?" Thorne glanced over at the new calendar on his wall. "It's the second day of planting. Time is already of the essence, isn't it?" Waynes nodded. "How many weeks did you say you thought we needed?" 2 to 3 weeks for training would be ideal, but really, how much of a fight can they offer?" "If they exist, Waynes," Thorne clarified. Of course. "And our count? How many able-bodied men between ages of 15 and 49? I have it right here," he said, standing up and handing a small sheet of paper to the general. "It's 130,000. Thorne stared at the numbers. "I expected it to be higher." Wayne shrugged in apology. "All of the non-able-bodied men and the boys took the herbs." "I suppose it should be enough," Thorne decided, cutting him off. "So how many do you want?" Waynes asked. Thorne looked up. "A fraction should remain here to keep the villages functioning, but I want the rest with me. The more men we have, the more territory we can cover. I want an army of 80,000 men. Every man will show up to his local fort for inspection to see if he is fit enough, which means able to walk a mile and carry a blade. We'll also need 4,000 women initially, probably more, to help with menial tasks. Waynes was taking notes. And by when do you want them? Thorne turned again to the calendar. I want them armed, trained, and ready by the 30th day of planting, in 4 weeks. 1 week to notify the world and conscript the army. 2.5 weeks to train, another 4 days to get everyone to Edge, he said, marking the dates on the calendar. Get there by the 29th, then the day after, that's when the army leaves on its search for Salem, the 30th day of planting. And if we don't find this mythical Salem? Waynes asked cautiously. We'll look for 2 weeks. Then we'll take Lek on his trip west. Major Twig looked around the forward command office on the 3rd day of planting, 365. The officers and sergeants crammed into the room watched him worriedly. The last time they met like this was when he announced all citizens of a certain age were to die. But Twig wasn't bleak today. He was strangely hopeful, although in an agitated sort of way. Edge just made everyone edgy. Men, I've received a message from General Thorne. It seems we're not the only village to send him a report of our unfavorable farming conditions. The problem is as widespread as the ash was, but he and the guide have a solution. The officers and sergeants held their collective breath. It has been revealed to the guide that there may be alternative lands. Twig watched Lieutenant Thorne's face when he said the words. The lieutenant burst into a grin and eagerly elbowed Sergeant Major Healy sitting next to him. Healy patted his arm and smiled. They'd been working together for a week now, sequestered in Twig's office at night, making lists, maps, plotting routes, and, it was obvious to Twig when he opened the message from the general, completely wasting their time. He sent both of them a look of warning. In order to find and properly explore these alternatives, Thorne's calling for an immediate increase in the army. He wants 80,000 men, with at least 4,000 support women. Each man either gasped, scoffed, or shouted. Some did all three, just as Twig had when he first read the message half an hour ago. 80,000? That's nearly every man left. Why so many? What is he expecting to find? The lieutenant's face fell as he mouthed the number. He'd originally only asked for 30. He looked at Healy for explanation, but the sergeant major's mouth was hanging wide open, incredulous. Twig paused to let the men settle down before continuing. The reason for the large number is that he hesitated again, unsure of how to explain the next part. It was quite unbelievable. But then again, he should be used to unbelievable ideas by now. It seems that we may not be the only ones living in the world. He held up his hands in vain to hold back the new onslaught of gasps, scoffs, and shouts of, "What's that supposed to mean?" Some moons ago, he continued loudly over the din of the officers, you may recall we had an incident with some of the trees coming down. That disaster was staged by a man who claimed that he had enough food to feed over 500,000 people. Twig kept his hands up to keep the comments down. It didn't work. He had to wait again before the room quieted enough for him to continue. After considerable thought about how that may be, as well as receiving some previously unknown information, and, he remembered to add, a guide lantern consulting with the Creator, Thorne has come to the conclusion that there is an unidentified village that may have resources. Thorne wants to begin a search for that village starting on the 30th, and because of its possible location, the most logical starting point for searching for that village is here in Edge. Twig ignored the outbursts and shouts of surprise from the rest of the officers. Instead, he stared intently at the lieutenant. He'd gone gray. Lek Thorne's eyes darted back and forth, and his lips moved rapidly as if mumbling. Finally, Twig could make out, "No, no, no, no!" Twig squinted as the sergeants and officers continued to loudly debate the implications of trying to bring so huge an army to their tiny patch of the world. Not even Healy, distracted by the arguing around him, noticed the increasing agitation of the lieutenant next to him. The lieutenant's hand went up to his mouth, then down again, and he shook his head rapidly. Twig had expected the lieutenant to be disappointed, but this behavior was odder than usual. Finally, the lieutenant held his head in his hands and stared at the floor. Twig considered his response, then turned to the rest of the room, but the men were too involved in loud discussions. Twig pulled out his long knife, which he had decided to keep with him at all times since the tree fall, and pounded the handle of it on the desk. "Order!" he called loudly. "Order enough! We've more than enough work to do in the next 4 weeks that we can't waste any time arguing." The men quieted and turned to the major with expressions suggesting that they weren't at all finished. "That's better," Twig said, sheathing his knife. "Beginning tonight, we post notices all over Edge. Tomorrow, we begin inspections of every man to see his fitness for the army." "What kind of standards are we looking for?" asked a captain. "A heartbeat," Twig sighed. "What about uniforms?" asked another man. "And weapons," called another. "For most men, uniforms will be whatever they already own in blue," Twig admitted. "There's a reserve of uniforms in the South. Sargon like to have a well-dressed army. Those will be for the men selected to be over groups of 100 and groups of 50, then the remaining uniforms distributed randomly. As for weapons, each man is to bring what he has. Thorn kept an arsenal of 20,000 swords in various secret locations in the north, but several of those are under deceit. Now he's working with some of Sargon's former officers to find similar stashes in the south. It may be not necessary for every man to have a sword, but it seems that there may be enough to outfit at least 2/3. The rest can carry long knives and bows and arrows that they may already possess. Any shops containing weapons are to turn them over to the fort immediately." This is impossible," said a staff sergeant. "How are we to move so many supplies for so great an army? There simply aren't enough horses or wagons or—" "Thorn knows that," Twig said. "Every man will carry his own food supply along with his bedroll. This will be an army on foot, gentlemen." Another officer rolled his eyes. "Just how far does Thorn think this new army will get? Untrained and out of shape and laden with supplies." Twig shrugged. "Thorn plans to march the army for 2 weeks, searching for the unknown village. Then, if unsuccessful, the army will return, rest for a few weeks, then continue on to the next plan." "The next plan? What's that?" Twig looked over to the lieutenant and Healy. "March west, beyond sands and the desert, to look for habitable land there." The lieutenant's head snapped up at that. Healy nudged him encouragingly, but the young officer's face was still troubled as the men around him broke into a new round of surprised shouts and protests. "West? Is there anything west?" Twig held up his hands again. "According to ancient texts, our ancestors used to live in the West, moving here 360 years ago. Perhaps it's time for us to return to our former home." "Let's go there first," Lieutenant Thorn said, suddenly energized. "That makes more sense. We know the West exists, but this mysterious village? Why waste time wandering around who knows where when we can just start west now? We don't even need an army, just a few of us, and I volunteer to go." Several of the officers nodded in agreement. "Let him go, Major. I volunteer some of my men to accompany him. Send him tomorrow." Twig sighed and held up his hands again, calling for silence. "Thorn wants to find the village, if it exists, first. If they have food reserves, we can use those immediately. Once we know of their resources, then we can decide if going west is still a necessity." The lieutenant kicked the chair in front of him in frustration. The master sergeant occupying it turned and gave him a dirty look. The lieutenant sighed angrily. Stupid, he muttered. This is stupid. It's all wrong. Lieutenant, Twig barked. If you have any comments about the present situation, you are certainly free to send your opinions to General Thorne yourself. In the meantime, show some respect for your father's decisions. Twig had never seen such a fierce look. He involuntarily took a step back as the lieutenant's bitter glare hit him. The lieutenant didn't say another word, but folded his arms and stared at a spot on the wall. Twig straightened his jacket and faced the room. We need to get to work. Now, we have less than a week to sign up and outfit all the men we can, then only 2.5 weeks to train them. Colonel Waynes has sent us an abbreviated training schedule. I'll be sure each of you has a copy by this evening. General Thorne and the rest of the army will be arriving by the 29th. We need to start thinking about where all of these men coming will camp. I think since our farmers have nothing to grow, we'll be taking over all their fields. Beginning tomorrow, men, all of you will be recruiting and training soldiers. Dismissed. Except for you, Lieutenant Thorne. The lieutenant continued his angry stare at the wall as the rest of the men filed out of the office and down the stairs. Twig stood in the front of the room watching him until the last man left. In my office, Thorne. The lieutenant got up with deliberate slowness, loudly pushing away a chair as he sulked into the command office. Twig followed him and shut the door with a bang. Sit down, boy, he ordered. Thorne took the closest chair and sat down in it carelessly. Twig moved to the back of his desk and sat down. I'm assuming you're disappointed, he said sardonically. The lieutenant didn't look at him. I demand more respect from you than that, Lec Thorne. The lieutenant sighed and sat up straight, then focused his glare on the major. That's better, sort of, Twig said. As an officer, you need to learn what behavior is appropriate in public and what is not. Your little outburst reminded me of a 14-year-old boy pouting because he's just been told to stock the woodpile instead of going fishing. That was deplorable and embarrassing. You should instead be grateful that the general has given your idea any consideration at all. That's a remarkable show of faith, and you should have been far more respectful. Yes, sir, the lieutenant mumbled. Twig scoffed. Ugh, at least pretend like you mean it, Thorne. If my father were here, he'd... The lieutenant began, then pressed his lips firmly together. Slightly better, but next time keep all those words in your head and let none of them escape. Twig sighed. Look, Lieutenant, the next few weeks are going to be unlike anything we've seen before. I need every man in my command willing to take my command. This will be a remarkable opportunity for you. You can be in charge of 1,000 men if you behave yourself. It's rare that a commander ever has that many men under him. But that's the opportunity before you right now. But only if you control your impulsiveness. You have a great capacity to lead, but you must do so within the framework the Army has established. Twig noticed the lieutenant's eyes glazing over. Apparently he'd heard a version of this speech before, probably from Slither or his mother. Thorne. He waited until the lieutenant looked him in the eyes. Can I count on you? Can your father count on you? The lieutenant's jaw shifted before he answered. Yes, sir. My father can count on me to do the right thing. For some reason, the major felt a chill run up his spine, but he nodded at the lieutenant. Then you are dismissed. Go inform Slither that your studies will be put on hold for a few weeks, and why. Your time will be taken up with more important matters. The lieutenant marched down the stairs and stomped out of the command tower, letting every footstep reveal the full anger he felt. It was wrong, wrong, wrong. He could think of nothing else as he strode back to the mansion to deliver the news to Slither. Not as if the professor didn't already somehow know. 80,000 men? Swarming all over Edge and beyond it? It'd take much less than 2 weeks for at least one of those men to get lucky enough to figure out the way to Salem. It was known, and probably by Thorn. How much he actually knew, the lieutenant didn't dare guess. Clearly enough to know that Edge was the closest village, and that it should have been called middle of the civilized world and not the edge of it. Maybe Thorn knew everything. That's why he wanted such a large army, to invade and take over Salem. Well, it wasn't going to happen. The lieutenant wouldn't let it happen. The timing was all wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong. He walked faster, hoping that would somehow inspire him as to what to do next. There was only one thing he could think of, and he didn't even know if it would work, but it was all he had. He needed to find Terrap's ruins first, before Thorn and the army came to Edge. It'd be a diversion, at least, to slow Thorn from finding Salem. If the lieutenant could bring back several bison as proof of the land and the options it provided, surely the general would decide to go west instead of to Salem. A diversion. Peito Shin had created a diversion. Suddenly, the lieutenant couldn't get his father out of his mind. Now he knew why Peito had come to the fort, wearing Colonel Shin's jacket. He'd offered Salem's food to the world. Their entire reserves that they'd been gathering for his whole life. What a ridiculous thing to do, just give it to the world? "Oh, Papa," he whispered, "this is all your fault. Why'd you do such a foolish thing? Weren't you called to secure Salem? And instead you're giving it away? You've invited the invasion." Another thought struck the lieutenant. Maybe Peito Shin wasn't in charge of security of Salem anymore. Maybe he'd acted on his own, irrationally. Maybe he had no authority to do what he did. The lieutenant growled in anger. Not even his own father, his real father, could be trusted. That meant there was only one man who could keep Salem safe. Good thing the lieutenant was on duty. Sergeant Major Healy was walking across the compound when he heard the footsteps catch up to him. "Well, Lieutenant," he said, glancing to his side, "looks like we're going to have an adventurous planting season after all, aren't we?" "Sir," the lieutenant said, keeping in step with him, "how badly do you want to find Terrap's land?" Healy chuckled lightly. "I suppose as badly as you want to." "We've got everything ready, right?" "On paper only. Why?" "How long do you think it would take to get everything together?" Healy stopped walking. "Lek," he said in a low voice. "Why?" "Sir, Poe, looking for this mysterious village is a waste of time. You know it as well as I do. If we wait too long, we won't have time to get anything planted in the West. By the general's timetable, we wouldn't be reaching the western lands until the end of planting season, or maybe even later." Healy grabbed the lieutenant's arm and pulled him over to a quiet corner of a building. "What are you wanting to do, Lek?" "The general's not expected to be here with the army until the 29th. If we leave tomorrow, we could be to Terrap's land and back before he gets here. We can capture and bring back several bison and convince him to give up the search for that other village." Healy looked around to make sure no one was listening. "Is this what Twig wanted to talk to you about in his office earlier?" "No," he had to admit. "So this isn't Twig's idea? Lek, I'm not about to do anything without permission from Twig and Thorn, and neither are you." The lieutenant grabbed his arm and shook it. "Don't you see? We have to. Thorn doesn't know what's best." "And you do?" "Yes." "If you aren't the most incorrigible, irrational—" The lieutenant couldn't have been more earnest. "Call me all the names you want. Right now I need to know, are you with me?" "Of course not." "Poe, why not?" "Because I've sworn allegiance to Thorn." "When you were drunk? Just last week you were ready to resign again. Do it now. I will too. And tomorrow we can head west." "No." Why not? Because I don't think it's a good idea now, that's why, Healy told him. You're too impulsive. Let Thorn do his little wandering around the forest and mountains for 2 weeks. Then we can go west with the proper supplies, men, and resources to do this safely. The lieutenant rolled his eyes. I can't believe you. Poe, your childhood dream. Just 1 day away, and you're saying no? When you get to be my age and have waited for childhood dreams, as you've put it, for so long, there's nothing wrong with waiting a few more weeks. Leck, what's wrong with you? Just wait. Thorn's not going to find anything. Then we get to go on our little adventure anyway. Safety in numbers, Leck. The lieutenant smacked the wall of the building in frustration. You're giving up. You're just as weak and intimidated by him as everyone else. He couldn't finish because Healy was shoving him hard up against the wall and knocked the wind out of him. Don't you ever accuse me of being weak, Lieutenant Thorn, Healy hissed. It's the weak ones who abandon their responsibilities and run away on a whim, soldier. I'm warning you now. Speak no more of this, or someone will think you're acting traitorous, and you just might find yourself in that dungeon you've wondered so much about. The sergeant major released the lieutenant, straightened his jacket, and marched on through the compound. But he could feel the lieutenant's glare boring holes into the back of his head. Traveling alone would be much faster anyway, the lieutenant decided that night, as he reviewed in his bedroom the copies of the notes he'd made with Healy. He learned long ago to always make copies of important papers, just in case. He looked at the calendar and grumbled silently. Healy did have a point about safety in numbers, but time was crucial now. If he had only a few more days, he could have recruited some locals to help him, but a new plan was forming in his mind. The people of Edge loved him. They always greeted him when he strolled through the village greens and helped deliver their rations for the week. Several girls winked at him on a regular basis. Men patted him on the back. Women gave him part of their bread rations. Little boys followed him, imitating his march. Little girls giggled shyly at him. Edge saw him as their friend in the fort. He remembered something from his command school training. The people will follow whoever feeds them. All he needed to do was capture some bison and rope them together like he had helped Uncle Deck do with his cattle a few times, find some evidence of vegetation, and bring it all back to the world. The people of Edge would be swayed to his cause when they saw the promise of fresh meat and large farms, all free for the taking. By the time Thorn would arrive, Edge would be his. That's when the confrontation would happen, in front of the entire army. There would be more than 80,000 men and women standing there, ready to make the decision. Would they follow the man who could guarantee food and land, or the man who killed their grandparents and was now trying to chase down a mythological village? The choice was obvious. His chest burned with anticipation. For a moment he considered slipping down to Lemuel's bedroom and retrieving one of his old general's uniforms in preparation for the day. But he remembered how ill-fitting Thorn's old lieutenant's jacket was. It didn't matter. When he was General Perrin-Shin, he could design any kind of jacket he wanted. Poe looked around him in surprise. He was standing in a field with a bright light all around him. He spun, trying to orient himself, trying to remember the last thing he did. He went to bed, right? And now he noticed a figure emerging from the bright light, someone tall, wearing dark clothing. As the figure neared and came into focus, Poe was dumbfounded. The figure grinned at him. Sergeant Major Qually Poe Healy, look at you. Not a little boy wearing silk shirts anymore, are you? Poe's mouth moved vainly in an attempt to speak. Finally, words came out. Colonel Shin! Colonel Shin chuckled. It's great to see you again, too, Poe. I want to tell you I'm proud of you. Look at what you've become. Poe tried to stand taller. He glanced down and saw he was in a full dress uniform, just like the colonel before him. "I owe this all to you, sir," he said in a shaking voice. "I always wanted to make you proud of me. I always looked up to you." "Even when I put you in chains and brought you to the incarceration building when you were 14? Shin queried. Poe looked down at the ground with an embarrassed smile. "All right, not then. I must admit I hated you then, and the other 3 times too. But I also hated myself. And you did what you had to do, didn't you?" he said, looking up again. "It tore me apart to see you like that, in chains," the colonel said, his dark brown eyes warm and bright. "But eventually you came around." "I did, sir, because of you." "No, Poe, you give me far too much credit." "No, sir," Poe insisted, elated for the opportunity to say the words he never thought he could. "Because you gave me another chance. First you came to visit me every single day that I was incarcerated. Not even my parents bothered to check on me. That 4th time, when I was in the inner cell for an entire season, you were the only one who ever cared. You even brought me blankets and extra rations when it became colder. You have no idea how much that meant to me, then and now. I wasn't the kindest to you then, but you never failed me. Then, when I came back to Edge right before that land tremor, no one wanted me. My father seemed disappointed to see that I was still alive, and when my parents refused to let me in the house, I had no idea what to do. I wanted a different life, but—" he shrugged. "I was sleeping in the village green that night when the land tremor hit. You found me that morning and put me on your horse." "You were so scrawny, my horse never noticed your presence," Colonel Shin interrupted, with a self-conscious smile in response to Poe's gushing. "Glad to see you've bulked up over the years." Poe smiled. "You brought me to your home, saw that I was fed, let me sit by your fire, let me wear your old coat." "Mari put my old coat on you," the colonel reminded him. "That's right, she did." He was taken aback by the way the colonel said her name, as if he still loved her. "But, sir, you visited me when I was locked up. Every day, sir, every day. I never forgot that. Then you were the one who put your sword into my hands that night after the land tremor. You're the one who entrusted me with the safety of your family." His chin trembled. "Sir, no one ever trusted me like that before. I felt such a responsibility to keep you safe so you could protect all of Edge." He looked down with a faint smile. "It was a good thing no one ever came by that night because I didn't have the foggiest idea of what to do with the sword. That thing was heavy, and I was out of shape." The colonel chuckled, and Poe was astonished at how familiar it sounded. "Poe, I know I told you this when you left, but I am sorry you were the one they had to send to Idemia to tell us about the condition of Edge, that you were transferred for stealing those horses along the way." Poe's head shot up. "Please don't be, sir. Riding back to Edge with you was the greatest experience of my life. And Grasses proved to be a very good place. Grampy Neeks took excellent care of me. I met several good officers, and—" he turned pink to reveal the next part— "I became a little famous in my own way." Colonel Shin tipped his head. "Oh, really?" Poe nodded eagerly, as if he were that 9-year-old boy again chatting with Captain Shin. "That play they did about you, The Midnight Ride of Colonel Shin? Well, it came to Grasses, and I went to see it with some soldiers, and one of them told the actors that I was the real Private Healy. They pulled me up on the stage, and everyone stood and applauded. After that, people would take me aside to ask what it was like to defend the supply train with Colonel Shin." The colonel grinned. "I'm so glad to hear it, Poe." "I was glad to do it, sir," Poe said proudly. "I don't know that I ever thanked you enough. I never got to see you again before you... Colonel Shin held up his hands to stop him. He looked exactly the way Poe remembered him. Broad, muscular, black hair with gray around the edges, and sparkling dark eyes. Seeing you as a successful sergeant major is more than enough thanks. I know that many, many soldiers look up to you. You now hold that fort at Edge together, Poe. Well done! His large hands gripped Poe's shoulders and squeezed them like a hug from a distance. Poe smiled, pleasant heat flushing through his body, originating from his shoulders, which the colonel released. I still wish I could do something more. Well, Colonel Shin said, rubbing his chin thoughtfully, now that you mention it, I am here to ask you to do me a favor. Anything, sir, the colonel sighed. Poe, there's another young man in Edge who's about to do something very stupid. And when he does, his father's not going to want him alive anymore either. No one will care what happens to him, but I care. Poe felt himself growing weak. Everyone thought it, but there had been no real evidence. Sir, he really is your grandson? Colonel Shin nodded. You've known it from the moment you first signed him up. You've felt me with him too. Very perceptive of you. And that's when the scent came to Poe again. Something earthy sweet. He'd never before remembered dreaming about a scent. Maybe this wasn't entirely a dream. Few people in the world feel anything anymore, the colonel continued. But you do, which says a great deal about your heart. Sometimes my grandson listens to me, but lately he shrugged in despair. He's ignoring me completely. But Poe, he's been listening to you. Poe straightened his back. Sir, what do you want me to do? What did I do to you, Poe? All kinds of things, he chuckled darkly. Had me watched, I suppose. You always seem to be where I'd end up, and... Oh, I see. An image came to his mind, a location just outside of Edge, and a young man on a horse with a pack horse approaching it. Yes, you do, Poe. And what did it take for you to come around? Poe frowned. I see. He felt the colonel squeeze his shoulders again, but the image of the lieutenant was still in his eyes. I love my stupid grandson, Poe. Please help him. You may be the only man who can. Poe opened his eyes to tell the colonel he'd be happy to do so, but instead found himself in bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. No, he whimpered that the dream was already over. But wonderfully, his shoulders still felt as if a massive man had recently gripped them. And in the darkness hung a scent, an odd but comforting combination of soil and sweet rolls. He wiped away his tears because he didn't have much time. It was still dark in the morning of the 5th day of planting when the lieutenant slipped out of a side door of the mansion and crept across the soft snow. He took it as a good sign that the air was warmer than it had been in more than 2 seasons. He hadn't bothered to light a fire last night in his room, and all around him was the unmistakable trickling noise of snow melting. If this weather continued, by the time he reached Terrap's Land, the ground might even be clear. He secured the large pack on his back, but needed to carry it only to the fort where he would saddle up Trigger and give a pack horse the burden of his extra clothing, rations, plans, maps, and bedroll. He knew the soldiers on duty at the stables. It wouldn't be hard to convince them to let him take the horses and a few bags of feed. He'd be on his way in less than half an hour. Getting to the fort in the dark wasn't a problem. Neither was acquiring Trigger and the pack horse. The soldiers believed the story that he was on a secret errand for General Thorne. Leaving the fort under the cover of darkness also wasn't difficult. He had a clear road before him, and everything was going his way, just as it had when he first took flight out of Salem. He should have noticed the similarities, but he didn't. Not until he was past the village limits and on his way south, following the contours of the hill. The sun started to rise above the frozen, swampy east, bathing the area in shockingly brilliant light. The first time in half a year, as if the world suddenly remembered how to let the sun shine in, it did so in dazzling glory. The intense light illuminated everything, including the 10 soldiers on horseback that suddenly appeared in front of him from behind a tangle of trees and boulders. The lieutenant reined trigger and the pack horse to a stop, as the soldiers formed a barrier in front of him. He licked his lips uncertainly, trying to figure out what this meant and what he could do about it, when he heard the voices behind him. He didn't even bother to turn around, but closed his eyes in defeat. "You were right, Sergeant Major Healy," Major Twigg said. "He is the thickest officer who's ever served. Lieutenant Thorne, I'm not surprised to hear myself say this, but I am disappointed. You are under arrest." And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you.